Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Ty Bricker Show. Here we go. So today, what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about World War I, World War II, with an emphasis on a few things like the United Nations, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. We're going to look at the League of Nations. The League of Nations was the preamble to the UN and NATO after World War I. We're going to kind of see what that looks like. Did the League of Nations have any teeth at all? Was it successful in accomplishing its mission statement, which was preventing World War II? Doesn't seem like it was really that successful. What we're going to do here is we're going to take a look at this history, this kind of 2-decade history in between World War I and World War II. Find out why exactly the Treaty of Versailles after World War I and then the League of Nations failed to execute what their primary mission statement was, and that was just simply preventing another catastrophic international global war that was going to cost the lives of tens of millions of human beings, which happened mere 21 years after the end of World War I. Go figure. I think this is pretty prominent today. Why? Well, there's a lot going on today, isn't there? There's a hell of a lot going on. We got Ukraine fighting Russia with NATO countries all over the place over there. What does that mean? We also have everything that's going on in Israel right now with Gaza and Israel and Iran, and Israel kind of in a lot of ways, just like they did in the lead up to the Iraq war, are talking about weapons of mass destruction, right? That's what led us into Iraq to begin with. And now we're talking about Iran's nuclear capabilities, which could possibly lead us into another big war in the Middle East. This is important. This kind of history is super duper important for us to understand and investigate if we want our sons and daughters to have a world to grow up in and live in and educate themselves in and have their own families in. We have to understand this stuff. We have to understand what our politicians are doing today, which is not very much different than politicians that did 100 years ago that got us into multiple massive, huge, gigantic world wars, only one of which can consider to be somewhat just. Obviously, World War I was not in any way just. Just for quick reference, how did World War I start? Well, World War I started, it was triggered after the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary in Sarajevo. Okay, that was in June of 1914 when that happened. And it was carried out by Serbian nationalists. That's what did that. What happened? That triggered a catastrophic war that killed tens of millions of human beings. All right, so let's take a look at this. Let's dive into it and see what we got. The world has knowingly been at war twice in history, 2 times, globally, World War I and World War II. Devastated the planet in ways that have never before been witnessed. World War I eliminated an estimated 37 million human lives, and cost the world over $180 billion at the time. World War II exterminated an estimated 70 to 85 million lives 21 years later and cost the world $1.3 trillion. The nuclear bomb was developed and then engaged against the citizenry of the Japanese Empire, changing the landscape of war forever. Obviously, nuclear technology, nuclear warfare. The United States is the only country in the world that has deployed nuclear weapons in combat. Changed the landscape of warfare forever. On top of the tens of millions that were killed during these wars, an unknown suffered horribly, lifelong wounds that would cripple or extinguish any individual chance of economic success moving forward. If you're killed economically, it's almost the same thing as being killed physically in today's society. If you're killed through credit or economic viability, it is almost as bad as starting your pistol in today's day and age. Additionally, shell shock, the term shell shock, was kind of institutionalized right after World War I, and it was suffered by troops, and the civilian population was immeasurable. The civilian population suffered from this as well in World War I and World War II. Today, we're closer to World War III than we have been since the days of the Cold War, unquestionably so. International institutions and non-governmental organizations, such as the United Nations or the UN, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization or NATO, were developed and tasked with eliminating any chance of world warfare moving forward. Coffee break, no Slurpee sounds. But can these institutions really deter the threat of total international war? Can they? Can they successfully execute their mission statement? Based on their checkered history, their inability to hold powerful developed nations accountable, and the ongoing escalating war in Ukraine and Israel, neither NATO nor the UN has the ability nor capability of preventing another world war, in my opinion. And we're going to go into it right now on why. Let's first examine these institutions a little. The birth of the United Nations was in 1945. The birth of NATO was in 1949, and they took place after the death of the League of Nations. The League of Nations was the brainchild of politicians and academics who desired to develop an international geopolitical strategy of eliminating international global world war. That was the idea behind the development of the League of Nations. This institution was created in 1920, immediately after the end of World War I, with the intention of promoting international peace and prosperity, as I stated. In this mission statement, this institution failed miserably. Pakistan, Syria, various other locations. That's how long it took for the League of Nations to fail and have two catastrophic wars. One war that killed 30 million people, one war that killed 80 million people. 20 years in between. That's how long it took between those two massive catastrophic wars. There are a variety of reasons for this, and the reasoning is just as justified today, right now, as we speak and breathe, right now, as it was before the start of World War II. It's just as it's all happening again. Renewed national. Some of these reasons are as follows. Okay, some of the reasons for kind of leading up to World War II are some of the following reasons. Renewed nationalism. Okay, this is previous to World War II. For example, the National Socialist Party, the Nazis, the Japanese Empire, Marxist-Leninist ideals that transformed into Stalinist ideals within the Soviet Union, leading to the Bolshevik Revolution. The establishment of the Fascist Party under Mussolini in Italy, who first established the Fascist Party. That's one reason. Economic devastation. Okay, the Treaty of Versailles with Germany. This is super interesting to know because some of you may or may not understand how substantially devastating the Treaty of Versailles was to Germany. Okay, it equated to territorial losses, demilitarization, and substantial reparations or payments as Germany was kind of independently blamed for World War I, which is interesting because, I mean, if you think about it, like World War I was started because of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand by an Austrian in Austria-Hungary by a Serbian nationalist. I mean, Germany didn't have really anything to do with it, but they triggered and went into war afterwards because of their alliances. All right. So let's take a closer look at the Treaty of Versailles. This is important. Territorial losses. Germany lost land to neighboring countries like France, Poland, and Belgium, and its overseas colonies were taken over by the Allied powers. That is a huge economic loss for Germany, right? Demilitarization. Germany's military was severely restricted, including limitations on the size of its army, navy, and air force. I mean, honestly, if you think about limitations, they really just dismantled their ability to have a standing army, really at all. Reparations. Germany was forced to pay financial reparations to the Allied powers, a sum eventually set to $6.6 billion. And this is like right after World War I. That's a substantial amount of money. Other provisions that are kind of meaningful. They had to demilitarize Rhineland, Rhineland in Germany, and they were prohibited to have an alliance with Austria. So Germany and Austria were now prohibited from being homies anymore. That could no longer take place. This also presented a feeling of humiliation for Germany and a lot of the Axis powers after World War I was over. And then finally, opportunity. What does opportunity mean? Emboldening them. Well, the League of Nations failed to act in 3 separate circumstances that were extremely monumental moving forward that would eventually lead Germany and these other nations to be like, you know what, I think we can arm up. I think we can get powerful again, because it doesn't really look like the League of Nations is doing shit. And those 3 things are the following: the Italian invasion of Abyssinia, the Spanish Civil War, and the Second Sino-Japanese War. These were 3 wars that the League of Nations was responsible for injecting themselves in and preventing based on their mission statement. They failed to execute this task. And because of this, these failures absolutely, without question, strengthened the resolve of the states that eventually became the Axis powers. This is all happening in between the world wars. All right. The League of Nations was tested and found to not have teeth. Because of this, Germany once again fired up its military industrial apparatus, creating one of the most violent and precise killing machines in known human history leading up to World War II. In doing so, it directly and overtly violated the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations. Not that they cared at all at that point. Again, the League of Nations was shown repeatedly 3 different times that they weren't going to do anything. Neither the Nazi Party nor the state of Germany was concerned. Okay, Germany, the Soviet. Here are the original Axis powers. All right, Germany, the Soviet Union before Germany flipped and invaded the Russian homeland at the beginning of World War II. Italy, Japan, Yugoslavia, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, and Croatia became the Axis powers. I'll say that again, okay, because this is important. Germany, Italy, Japan, Yugoslavia, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, and Croatia, and Russia, before Russia got invaded by Germany, were the original Axis powers. With full understanding that war was inevitable after Germany's invasion of Czechoslovakia, followed immediately by Germany's invasion of Poland. All of these countries understood that when this happened, they had a full understanding of that this would trigger the League of Nations. And they didn't care. Why didn't they care? Because the League of Nations didn't do dick up to that point. They didn't care. All right? Fear of another potential world war did not deter the Axis powers in any way, shape, or form. One must really think about what this means. Okay? It had only been 21 years since the last catastrophic war that can only be described accurately as men churning other men into meat with mechanized equipment never before seen on the battlefield, generating death and injury at a rate unprecedented in human history. 21 years after that, the Axis powers didn't give a damn. And they had lost millions fighting in that war. And they knew that the League of Nations wasn't going to do anything. Dan Carlin, host of the podcast Hardcore History with Dan Carlin. If you're a history dude or dudette and you don't listen to Dan Carlin Hardcore History, I don't know what you're doing with your life, because this guy is phenomenal. He's fantastic. Okay, he best describes the environment a typical soldier faced during World War I in trench warfare. All right, quote: trench warfare, fully automatic, water-cooled machine guns, mustard gas, and artillery, death from above. Soldiers with 19th century gear facing the mechanized weaponry of the 20th century. Soldiers with 19th century gear facing the mechanized weaponry of the 21st century. This is still a quote, but I got to say this. During this time, dudes were charging into battle on horseback still with swords into machine gun fire from fully automatic machine guns that were shooting anywhere from 600 to 1,000 rounds a minute per machine gun. And these guys were charging across battlefields on horses holding swords and bayonets and stuff. They did not understand what mechanized warfare was going to be. And World War I was a complete shit show disaster because of that. Continuing the quote, in a single day in engagement, there could be 50 to 60,000 casualties on one side. 50 to 60,000 casualties on one side. They had never, soldiers that were used to poking other soldiers with pointy sticks and pieces of metal to kill them, to win, had never experienced mechanized warfare before. I mean, 50 to 60,000 casualties per day in an engagement it just basically tells you that the commanders had no idea what they were doing. They were just throwing bodies at these weapon systems, hoping that the meat would eventually overcome the technology. I mean, that's really what they were doing. The artillery, freezing weather, and dead bodies left in the trenches for years generated an almost mattress-like feel at the bottom of the trenches, created a memory or experience most closely resembling Mordor from Lord of the Rings. This was 21 years earlier. 21 years earlier, a recent memory branded into mankind, into humanity as a whole, and it meant nothing. It meant nothing. The world, humanity, was once again ready to send their sons, brothers, fathers, sisters, daughters, and mothers into the meat grinder of modern mechanized warfare. End quote. Two interesting things from this quote, besides what I talked about initially with people charging on horses into machine gun fire. The mattress-like feel at the bottom of trenches. So these dudes, when in my war, we would deploy for 3 to 6 months or 6 months to a year, depending on what the mission was or what outfit you were with. You'd come home, gear up, see your family, whatever, redeploy. These guys didn't do that, man. These guys, when they got over there, they were there for the duration. They were there from the beginning to the end. If it took years of you being there and fighting, then you were there for years. And that's what it was like for these guys, okay? And so that trench warfare is, the Twilight Zone, Mordor. It's very hard to rationalize in the human brain how horrific that was. For years, as dudes were getting smoked in the trenches, they would go down into the mud, and they would kind of just get stomped into their bodies would get stomped into the mud by their comrades who were still fighting for their lives, and their bodies would kind of melt into the dirt and the mud of the ground. And it would generate a rubbery mattress-like effect for the guys that were still there standing on top of them. I mean, they were standing on top of meat, bone, dirt, and mud, all combined, all welded together into this form that created a spongy feeling for years. I mean, if you could imagine living in that environment for years like that, what that would do to you psychologically and emotionally when you went back to humanity however many years later or however many battles later or anything, to think that these men could somehow just become normal again is beyond a reasonable expectation. Anyway, besides the point. Another one. So Mordor from Lord of the Rings. An individual by the name of J.R.R. Tolkien wrote the Lord of the Rings books. What's neat about this guy is he was a World War I vet. And he had seen a hell of a lot of combat. And when he wrote the Lord of the Rings books in Mordor, he pulled from his experiences, his World War I experiences, and he injected those feelings and those memories and those thoughts into his books on the Lord of the Rings. He would spend, the movies are great. The books are unbelievable. He spends chapters detailing single battles. Like the smells, the senses, the touch, what you see, what you smell, how you felt, every aspect of that battle. That's how he dealt with his shell shock. That's how he dealt with his PTSD from the war, is that he wrote about it, and he created fictional characters and a fictional language and all kinds of crazy stuff to deal with it. He was in the Battle of the Somme in World War I. And just so you guys know, as a reference, the Battle of the Somme was like a 4-month battle, generated 1 million casualties in 4 months. 1 million casualties in 4 months. There's like 500,000 British, a couple 100,000 French, over 500,000 Germans in 4 months. I mean, it was just a crazy battle. And that dude was there. And then he wrote The Lord of the Rings shortly after that. So World War II, getting back to what we got going on here, World War II was not prevented by the League of Nations, nor did the Treaty of Versailles prevent World War II. And it took only 21 years for a catastrophic war to happen again, only this time on an even grander scale. It is imperative that humanity remembers these outcomes. That's what I said. For no matter how much society trusts the United Nations, no matter how much society trusts NATO with its peace and tranquility mission statements, it only takes one or two bad actors, one or two bad states to plunge the world back into the depths of Mordor, as J.R. Tolkien wrote about in Lord of the Rings. What is the fundamental goal of NATO? Question mark. Quote, NATO's fundamental goal is to safeguard the Allies' freedom and security by political and military means. Quote again, NATO's fundamental goal is to safeguard the Allies' freedom and security by political and military means. NATO is comprised of 30 member states. 30 member states make up the entirety of NATO. The most prominent members being the United States, Germany, France, the United Kingdom, Turkey, and Italy. When we talk about the Security Council and the UN, you'll kind of see that some of these states play a few different roles here, because right now we're talking about NATO. The most prominent members are the United States, Germany, France, the United Kingdom, Turkey, and Italy. The most immediate concern facing to NATO today, right now, is the Russian invasion of Ukraine and what's going on in Israel and Gaza, and what could possibly pull Iran in and us into another global catastrophic shit show. So with Ukraine and Israel generating extensively high casualty rates, the sources for these casualties and numbers are somewhat unreliable right now, so I'm not going to really go into that. They're mimicking, but in Ukraine, the warfare they're experiencing over there mimics the trench warfare of the early 20th century that we talked about before. They are fighting in trenches, and it is very similar to World War II, World War I battlefield conditions. Released video footage of the ongoing combat documents this comparison. You can get on X, you can get on whatever, you can find a lot of videos of the Ukraine-Russian fighting, and you will see that it is very much like trench warfare of World War I. The expectation is that the entire Ukrainian population is projected to engage Russian forces if necessary. This is 100% true. Why? Why is this true? Well, these videos, you can find these videos about anywhere, of these unmarked vans driving around Ukraine, and they see a dude. He could be 60 years old, he could be 70 years old, he could be 40 years old. They don't really give a shit. Pulls up next to him while he's walking his dog or he's with his kids or something, and they will get out with masks and they will grab his ass up, zip tie him, and throw him in the back of that van, give him a weapon system and a plate carrier, and take his ass right out to the front, drop him off. There you go. Good luck. So that's the expectation over there right now, and it's happening. Currently, NATO states that border Russia. So what are the NATO states that currently border Russia, and why would this be important? Norway, Eastern Latvia, and Estonia. That's 754 miles of Russian territory that is currently bordered by NATO states, right on the border, as if they were Canada or Mexico. Additional countries seeking NATO membership on top of those countries that border Russia, these are countries that are seeking NATO membership that also border Russia, are Finland, Ukraine, and Belarus. All right, obviously Ukraine. If admitted, and this is important, if admitted, Russia's entire western front or border would be NATO states. They would extensively isolate the entire superpower. Just like how we got to Americanize this a little bit. It's important that we understand it from our American eyes, which are very, very sheltered eyes, by the way, compared to the rest of the world. We have Canada on the north, we have Mexico on the south, we have the Pacific on the west, we have the Atlantic on the east. Strategically, we're located geographically about as good as any superpower could ever wish to be located in the history of superpowers. We are, because of that, the American public, we have a very, very rose-colored lens of the world. Because unlike countries that are embedded surrounded by a whole bunch of other countries in Europe, other countries that could be engaged in civil war, they could be engaged in revolution, they could be a failing country, right? And all of a sudden a whole bunch of refugees are running into your country. We don't experience that here in the United States, so it's hard for us to rationalize what it would be like, for example, like the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people that are coming out of Gaza, going into Egypt and all these other countries and then into Europe and stuff. Like, it's hard for us to imagine that because we have Canada on the north, Mexico on the south, the Pacific on the west, and the Atlantic on the east. We're extremely isolated. We might as well be on the moon. We're very, very isolated. So what would it mean if Russia or China or Iran put not nuclear, but just regular military bases in Canada or Mexico? What would the United States reaction be? It might be similar to what Russians' reaction is right now to a whole bunch of NATO countries being on their border. It might be, I mean, if you think about the Bay of Pigs in Cuba, what did they do? They went down to Cuba, the Russians. They put in a little military base there, kind of covertly, put in some missile silos that could possibly have been nuclear weapons. And the eventual outcome of that was the Bay of Pigs and an assassination of an American president. I mean, I think the JFK assassination in a lot of ways is directly linked to the Bay of Pigs and how pissed off they were about not getting air support and that whole deal. And there was a bunch of World War II guys that were kind of training up a bunch of Cubans, and they got really pissed off about kind of being abandoned there. And so that's a whole different topic for a whole different day. But I mean, the Bay of Pigs is a great example. The United States was not going to allow Russia to have a freaking military base that close to our country. And that doesn't even border. I mean, Canada doesn't really border our country because there's water in between Florida and Cuba. Not Canada, sorry, Cuba. But these other states that border Russia, these are bordering states. I mean, it's the same land. There's no water separating them. And so you got to think about that as an American a little bit, because there's no way, dude. There's no way that we would let Russian, Chinese, Iranian, North Korean military installations on our border. We would never let that happen. So you gotta be honest about that. More alarming is Ukraine's border to NATO states. So Ukraine borders a bunch of NATO states too. And why is this important? And what are those states? Those states are Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania. So the war between Russia and Ukraine is primarily being fought in Ukraine, not Russia, right? Well, Ukraine has a whole bunch of bordering NATO states. What would happen if one of these border NATO countries, such as Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, or Romania, was overtly or covertly or even accidentally targeted by Russian forces or Russian actors or even Ukrainian actors pretending to be Russian to try to invoke Article 5 of NATO? Well, what is Article 5 of NATO, you asked? Well, I'm glad you asked that. Quote, an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all. Quote, again, Article 5 of the NATO Charter. So when you hear people on the news saying Article 5 could get invoked if so-and-so happens, this is Article 5. An armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all. So if Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, or Romania, that all border Ukraine, somehow, some way get a missile accidentally shot off into their country, somebody gets killed, there is a high probability that Article 5 gets invoked, and now we're all in. Everybody's jumping, and World War III starts. Just like that. It could be that easy. I mean, it could really, really be that easy. That's what Article 5 is with NATO. That's how close we are right now to sending our own sons and daughters in to fight another war. So what has Russia's response been to engaging in warfare this close to NATO countries or allies? What has their response been? Are they in any way worried about invoking Article 5 within NATO? To throw more money, bodies, and weaponry into the fight, the most powerful member of NATO is the United States, unquestionably. And the answer to that is Russia, like I said, they don't give a shit. To date, the United States has sent $70 billion in aid to Ukraine, around $70 billion of American taxpayer money to Ukraine. This does not include weapon systems, people. Okay, so if you think about F-16s, if you're thinking about tanks, if you're thinking about small arms, in munitions. That's not in the 70 billion. That's separate. But those weapon systems are worth a hell of a lot of money. That's for darn sure. And on top of those weapon systems and the aid are American boots on the ground. Yes, we have American boots on the ground over there. There's dudes that I worked with personally as a contractor that are over there right now, and they're doing work 100%. They're working for Ground Branch with the agency. They're working as contractors through the agency. They're over there. So there is a possibility that at any time you could lose American troops over there as well, which could also trigger a completely brand new global war. All right. This action, our help with Ukraine, is overt. It's absolutely overt and completely known and understood by Russia. Okay. They know all about it. They know all about who's there. President Biden in February 20th of 2023, this is kind of the Biden policy towards the ongoing escalating potentially nuclear conflict with Ukraine and Russia. Quote, this was their policy. The United States reaffirms its unwavering support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, extending to its territorial waters. The U.S.-Ukraine relationship serves as a cornerstone for security, democracy, and human rights in Ukraine and the border region. We will continue to support Ukraine in its efforts to advance its Euro-Atlantic aspirations and to restore and secure Ukraine's internationally recognized borders. Now, that was the policy of the Biden administration. It was very overt. We did not hide it in any kind of way from Russia. Trump's policies are a little bit different. Same thing with Iran. Even though he kind of came into office and he said, within the first 10 minutes of me being in office, there's not going to be any more war in Gaza or Israel. There's not going to be any more war in Ukraine and Russia. Well, that kind of happened. And then it all fired right back up again. I mean, we all know that Israel's right back at it in Gaza, bombing like crazy. And Ukraine and Russia are still going at it. And we're in the process of trying to get a mineral deal to get them to pay us back. And I mean, who knows how all that's going to look. But I don't think we're really that much. We're different than the Biden administration for sure through Trump. But it does not change how dangerous this position is with us right now, with having Article 5 invoked should any of these other countries be attacked or have anything happen. We're in a very, 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 very dangerous place right now. Okay. The U.S. has spent a tremendous amount of financial and military resources in this fight, a tremendous amount of military resources and money in this fight. And with the fight in Israel. Clearly, the U.S. is deeply invested in the outcome of this. Okay, has this detoured Russia at all, even a little bit? I mean, invoking Article 5, NATO, all the border countries and states, has it changed how they're acting? Did it change how Germany acted? No, Germany didn't give a shit. Right? I mean, the League of Nations didn't deter Germany at all, and NATO is not deterring Russia in any kind of way a little bit. After finally disengaging from a 20-year war, the global war on terrorism, the United States, my war, right? The vast amount of blood and treasure it cost the American citizenry, 20 years of fighting, dudes that served at the very beginning of the war. At the end of the war, if they hadn't been killed and if they were still deploying, were serving with their kids. I mean, 20 years later, their kids were in service and deploying to fight in combat, and they were serving with their own damn parents because the war had been going on for so long. We just came out of this. And it doesn't really seem like the American government really could give a shit about sending us either to fight Russia or to fight Iran at this point. Just immediately after that war, like, whole different generation of war fighters. And they're like, yep, send them in. All right. The design of the United Nations. Let's look at the United Nations a little bit, see how it compares to NATO. The design of the United Nations is similar to that of NATO. However, the UN is additionally focused on humanitarian obligations on top of their military obligations. The mission statement of the United Nations is as follows, quote, the scope of UN authority consists of 5 prominent ideals. 1, maintain international peace and security. 2, protect human rights. 3, deliver humanitarian aid. 4, support sustainable development and climate action. That's an interesting one. 5, uphold international law, peace, dignity, and equality on a healthy planet. Okay, end quote. The climate action one's interesting. We're going to look at that a little bit deeper here in a minute. In 1945, the UN consisted of 51 member states. 51 member states in 1945. Today, membership within the UN has grown to 193 states. Like NATO, just like in NATO, the U.S. is the dominant financial contributor. The United States contributed more than any other country in the world to NATO and the United Nations. Not sure how you guys feel about that, but we give them a hell of a lot of money. We are their number one contributor for both of them. However, the U.S. makes up only 1/5 of the Security Council. The Security Council consists of Russia, China, France, the United Kingdom, and the United States. That is the Security Council. In theory, the Security Council decides how international peace, security, and maintenance is to be conducted. For example, these are a couple of good examples. After 9/11, the Security Council overwhelmingly approved of America's invasion of Afghanistan, based primarily on self-defense concerns. The Security Council said, roger that, go. The United States had been attacked. Osama bin Laden was kind of verified to be in Afghanistan. We attacked Afghanistan, self-defense concerns, roger that, you're good. However, and this is where it gets a little bit tricky, okay? The Security Council did not approve of America's invasion of Iraq. They did approve of America's invasion of Afghanistan, did not approve of America's invasion of Iraq. According to the United Nations, this was an absolute do not do scenario to the United States when it came to Iraq. Weapons of mass destruction, right? You can go back and look at this. In the early 2000s, Benjamin Netanyahu was testifying before Congress talking about weapons of mass destruction, how the United States, it was imperative that the United States invade Iraq to stop this, the development of weapons of mass destruction. 20 years later, what are we hearing right now? Benjamin Netanyahu says the United States needs to go to war with Iran. Why? Weapons of mass destruction. Well, that's interesting. I mean, I got a whole bunch of deployments in the Middle East, and even though Israel kind of sold us on the weapons of mass destruction, and in turn the administration sold the American public on the terms of weapons of mass destruction. There were no Israeli soldiers fighting with us over there. There's a lot of soldiers from a lot of other countries, but no Israeli soldiers. I didn't really think anything about that at the time. I feel a lot about it now. Just kind of on a personal level. And so, anyway, that's just besides the point. I don't think that really matters, but it just kind of matters to me, I guess. So, where were I? This did not deter the United States, right? When it came to the Security Council not approving of the United States to invade Iraq. This is, once again, like, what is there any teeth with these institutions at all? We invaded Iraq anyway, weapons of mass destruction. The consequences for America after kind of, thumbing its proverbial nose at the United Nations was nothing. There was no consequences at all. There's zero consequences, just like there was no consequences for all the invasions that took place when the League of Nations was supposed to stop countries from doing that. Interestingly, Russia sits on the Security Council as well. Russia sits on the Security Council. Russia's invasions of Ukraine was not endorsed by the UN either. So the UN did not endorse America's invasion of Iraq, and the UN didn't endorse Russia's invasion of Ukraine either. And have they done anything about either one of those circumstances, which was supposed to be a global agreement? Nope, not at all. Has there been any consequences for Russia through the UN? No. Clearly, the rules, laws, ideals of the UN only apply to weak and underdeveloped nations. I mean, that's if you really want to know, that's really what it's about here. If you're a weak or underdeveloped nation, the UN, NATO, they will crush you if you violate anything. If you are a powerful nation, the UN and NATO might as well just not even exist, quite frankly. Powerful nations sit on the Security Council, openly espouse ideals centered around peace and prosperity. But when they decide to intervene or invade another country militarily, endorsement of the United Nations or the lack of endorsement of the United Nations has no effect on them at all. Okay, so let's examine some of the failures of the United Nations that have led to a lot of deaths internationally. Okay, these include, but are not limited to, Cambodia, 1975 to 1979. 25% or 2 million Cambodians were murdered by the Cambodian government. UN did nothing. Somalia Civil War, 1991 to present. 500,000 dead, to include the Battle of Mogadishu or the Battle of the Black Sea. 18 dead American soldiers, U.S. Army Rangers, and members of CAG, Combat Applications Group, or Delta, were involved in that. All right. The Rwandan Civil War. This was the Rwandan genocide in 1994. This was probably the worst out of all of them because of the publicity with it. This was during the Clinton administration. 800,000 Tutsis were murdered by machetes. 800,000 primarily murdered by machetes. 250,000 women were reportedly raped in 3 months. So in 3 months, they killed 800,000 Tutsis with machetes, and at least 250,000 women were violently and horribly raped in that time. The Srebrenica massacre in Serbia, 1995. 8,000 Muslim men and boys were murdered by Serbian troops under the command of former General Ratko Mladic in Serbia. This was in July of 1995. This was the worst mass killing on European soil since World War I. This was on European soil. This was right there. This was the worst mass killing since World War II. Nothing. Darfur conflict in Sudan, 2003 to present, 200,000 murdered, 2.5 million displaced. Iraq invasion, 2003 to 2011. This is us. At least 1 million Iraqis dead. Sold to the American public on the false pretenses of weapons of mass destruction. Syrian Civil War, 2011 to present, 161,000 dead, 6.2 million displaced. South Sudan, 2013 to present, 383,000 dead, 1.8 million displaced. Yemen Civil War, 2014 to present, numbers unknown. Myanmar, 2017 to present, 24,000 dead, 750,000 displaced. What's currently going on in Gaza, where the estimated numbers are around 50,000-ish dead, to include like around 20,000 children. It's just all over the place, and it's happening all the time. And these institutions are designed, stood up, and funded to prevent it. And it kind of just seems like what they really prevent is they prevent those people from getting killed by their inaction and their individual enrichment, if you ask me. These examples provide us with real-time numbers and outcomes. Unquestionably, the UN has failed on an unprecedented level. The fact that the UN exists, has the ability to intervene militarily, has the backing of the world's biggest and strongest superpowers, and a substantial amount of funding, does nothing, zero things, to deter anyone from doing anything that they want, it would appear. Bad people continue to do bad things. And those that sit on the Security Council have been some of the worst violators of international law and human rights, Russia and the United States, okay? One might think that the UN is focused on secondary concerns instead of human life. Why would it seem like that? Well, let's go back to the 5 points of the charter, right? Which one of them talked about climate stuff. Let's look at that a little bit. It appears to be obvious that there's more money and motivation in developing climate research for the benefit of international elites than deploying soldiers to harshly suppress and violently quell evil actors. The climate investments among United Nations nations are at least $321 billion annually, every year. I'll say that again. The climate investments among UN nations are at least $321 billion annually. As Rousseau, and those of you might know Jean-Jacques Rousseau from the Enlightenment, would say the following: man is naturally free, and civil society takes his freedom away from him. He is dependent on the law, and the law is made to favor the rich. It would appear so. It would appear Rousseau kind of knew what he was talking about. The world has entrusted international organizations and institutions such as the UN and NATO with maintaining our peace and security, our economic future, our futures of our children and our families. Furthermore, the citizenry of the developed world has invested their own financial resources as well as their sons and daughters militarily to ensure peace and prosperity. But these ideals seem to fall on deaf ears. When a powerful international actor decides to independently engage another country, the UN almost universally fails to act. And NATO does a very good job at escalating an already extremely intense situation, especially in Europe. Make no mistake, the world is at the brink of nuclear war. Not just World War III, nuclear war. A global reset. The likes of the Younger Dryas cataclysm from 12,000 years ago, where all of those global flood stories stem from, a global reset. Don't think for 1 second that a nuclear war would not immediately mean another global reset of humanity. 100%. Russia is not going to de-escalate the war with Ukraine. Ukraine is not willing to negotiate with Russia. And NATO is openly calling for an all or nothing scenario. Ukraine wins at all costs, it would seem. The cost of your kids? Is that acceptable to you? I got 5. It's not acceptable to me at all. And if you don't have kids and you say it's acceptable, you can kind of just go fuck yourself, because I really don't care what your opinion is. The U.S. is not advising Russia and Ukraine to negotiate up until now a little bit with Trump, a little bit. On the contrary, the U.S. has been very close to sending in our own warfighters. As a matter of fact, we have sent in our own warfighters. Like I said, we have boots on the ground over there right now. If a no-fly zone is enacted over Ukraine, whose pilots will man it? Whose pilots will enforce it? If a NATO pilot shoots down a Russian MiG, what will Russia's response be? What if the pilot that shoots down that MiG is American? Will Russia declare war on America, in turn declaring war on NATO? In turn invoking Article 5? And we have a scenario to where, just like the First World War, which was 30 million, and the Second World War, which was 80 million, you get the Third World War, we're talking hundreds of millions. Will China, Iran, North Korea, or any other country join Russia, theoretically establishing another group of Axis powers? I would think so. The next world war will involve nuclear powers, and the doomsday clock has once again started. This generation is far too removed. This generation in the United States, with our rose-colored glasses, and our TikTok, and our Instagram, and our 30-second sound bites that we can pay attention to, are way too far removed from reality and the atrocities of the past to fully grasp the vastness of this situation and the horrific outcomes that this situation can produce. The World War II generation was only 21 years removed from World War I. 21 years. And that did nothing to curtail the inevitable. 21 years after 30 million people died, they went ahead and killed 80 million more people. Do you think that our politicians today wouldn't be willing to kill even more than that? I mean, really? If you do, or don't, I highly recommend reading the book War is a Racket by Smedley Butler, who was a World War I Marine who won the Medal of Honor. At that time, he was the most decorated soldier in American history. And he wrote a more of a pamphlet than a book, about 40 pages, very easy read, about World War I and the military-industrial complex way before Dwight Eisenhower even coined the term, way before, decades before. Highly recommend you guys look into that. The UN is not going to save the world. NATO is not going to save the world. On the contrarily, if anything, they'll just escalate the tensions. The only thing that can save the world at this point in time is cooler heads, really. Ideals are nothing more than ideals until promoted into practice. The last 100 years have given the world an unbelievable amount of data. We have 100 years worth of documented data for this. The 20th century was by far the deadliest known century in human history, by far, not even close. Everything the world needs to know to stop another catastrophic global war is available to be studied. It's right here for you. You can dive into it any time you want. The prominent philosophical ideals of the past have almost all been implemented in real time, all of them. And the outcomes are known. We've tried them. The world cannot count on an international organization. The world cannot count on an international organization to stop another world war. Previous outcomes verify their lack of ability to execute their own designed strategies. All right. And with that, before getting too much more into the weeds, appreciate y'all. Have a good one.